David Kellerman had learned to appreciate the back row of courtrooms after his supervisors decided that his interpretive creativity posed too great a risk to interstellar diplomacy. The official report diplomatically termed his translation errors as excessive contextual embellishment, which was a polite way of saying he'd accidentally started 3 minor diplomatic incidents by explaining alien humor in ways that made perfect sense to him and absolutely none to anyone else. Now he sat with his recording equipment and official observer credentials, documenting proceedings for archives that existed primarily to ensure legal compliance rather than actual human interest. The Galactic Tribunal's courtroom was a marvel of crystalline architecture that amplified emotional resonance and translated intent across species barriers, creating an environment where justice theoretically transcended the limitations of individual biology. Queen Vithara of the Nexarian Coalition stood at the defendant's platform with the kind of composure that suggested either complete innocence or absolute resignation to fate. She was tall, elegant, and would have been entirely human except for the pointed ears that swept back from her silver hair like delicate sculptures, designed by someone with strong opinions about aerodynamic aesthetics. Those ears, David had noticed over the weeks of proceedings, twitched with micro-expressions that revealed emotional states her carefully controlled features never displayed. The trial had been proceeding with the glacial pace typical of interstellar legal proceedings, covering charges of trade violations, territorial disputes, and what essentially amounted to tax evasion on a planetary scale. David had translated enough similar cases to recognize the pattern: lengthy presentations of evidence, diplomatic protests about jurisdictional authority, and eventual resolution through fines and trade restrictions that satisfied everyone's need to appear decisive, while changing absolutely nothing about the underlying problems. Chief Prosecutor Veltharian of the Commercial Regulation Authority was concluding his final arguments with the kind of exhaustive detail that made David grateful. He was only required to document rather than actively participate. The evidence clearly demonstrates systematic violation of interstellar commerce regulations, unauthorized territorial expansion, and deliberate circumvention of established tax protocols. The prosecutor declared, his crystalline form refracting light in patterns that David's cultural training identified as absolute legal certainty. The tribunal's 3 judges, a collection of beings whose various forms of consciousness ranged from crystalline matrices to what appeared to be sentient energy patterns with strong opinions about jurisprudence, conferred through harmonics that made David's recording equipment register colors instead of sounds. When they finally announced the verdict, their combined voice carried the weight of cosmic authority. Queen Vithara of the Nexarian Coalition, you are found guilty on all charges as presented. The tribunal will now hear proposals for appropriate restitution. David settled back in his chair, expecting the usual diplomatic dance of proposed penalties, appeals for leniency, and carefully negotiated settlements that would allow everyone to claim victory while admitting nothing. Instead, Queen Vithara rose from the defendant's platform with fluid grace and spoke in perfect, unaccented standard. Honored tribunal, I propose restitution in the form of a human prize. The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds before the courtroom erupted into chaos that made David's previous translation disasters look like minor social awkwardness. Delegates from 17 different species began vocalizing, harmonizing, shrieking, and in several cases, what appeared to be stress-induced bioluminescent displays that painted the crystalline walls in patterns David's cultural training helpfully identified as extreme diplomatic outrage. The human delegation, led by Ambassador Santos and legal coordinator Williams, leaped to their feet with protests that David could hear clearly despite the multilingual cacophony. Violation of interspecies rights, human trafficking, Slavery protocols. This is absolutely unacceptable under any interpretation of galactic law. Queen Vithara stood calmly at the center of this diplomatic storm, her pointed ears twitching with what David's experience suggested might be amusement rather than the expected legal desperation. When she raised her hand for silence, the gesture carried enough royal authority to cut through the chaos like a blade made of pure dignity. "I invoke Article 12 of the Interstellar Restitution Protocols," she announced, her voice carrying harmonics that made the crystalline courtroom resonate with unexpected music. "The right of the convicted to propose culturally appropriate compensation for crimes against interspecies commerce." Chief Judge Mordenthon, whose energy pattern shifted to configurations David had learned to recognize as profound legal confusion, addressed the Queen directly. "Your Majesty, Article 12 requires that proposed restitution serve the interests of justice while respecting the rights of all involved parties. The demand for sentient beings as compensation violates fundamental principles of interstellar law." "Unless," Queen Vithara replied, and her ears twitched with what David was now certain was suppressed satisfaction. "The sentient being in question volunteers for legal protection under asylum protocols, gaining access to harmonic safe key technology that serves the greater interests of interstellar justice." David blinked several times, processing this statement through his linguistic training. The Queen wasn't demanding a slave or prisoner. She was requesting a witness, someone who could access systems and databases that her people couldn't penetrate, protected by legal frameworks that would make their cooperation legitimate rather than treasonous. The courtroom's chaos shifted from outrage to confusion as legal experts began frantically consulting archives, searching for precedents that might explain what the Queen was actually proposing. David watched her face during this process, noting the level of controlled fear beneath her royal composure that suggested whatever she was trying to accomplish was more important than her personal freedom or dignity. Through the diplomatic noise, he heard Ambassador Santos addressing the tribunal with barely controlled anger. "The human delegation objects to any interpretation of restitution law that treats citizens as property to be claimed by convicted criminals." Queen Vithara's silver eyes swept the courtroom until they found David in the back row, and for a moment, their gazes met across the crystalline space. In that instant, he saw something that made his translator instincts twitch with recognition. She wasn't just playing legal games or making desperate gestures. She was trying to save someone's life, possibly her own, and definitely more people than anyone in the courtroom understood. "The human would not be property," she said quietly, though her voice carried clearly through the chamber's acoustic design. "They would be protector, witness, and keeper of truths that others seek to silence." The tribunal called a recess, while their legal processors worked through centuries of interstellar precedent law, leaving the courtroom buzzing with the kind of diplomatic tension that made David's recording equipment register anxiety as a measurable atmospheric disturbance. Most delegates clustered in species-specific groups, engaging in heated discussions that his linguistic training allowed him to follow across multiple conversational threads simultaneously. The human delegation had formed a defensive circle around Ambassador Santos, their voices carrying the particular strain that came from realizing a routine legal proceeding had evolved into something approaching an interstellar incident. David remained in his observer position, officially invisible and therefore free to study Queen Vithara as she stood alone at the defendant's platform, her royal bearing intact despite being surrounded by delegates who were treating her request as somewhere between outrageous and potentially treasonous. Her pointed ears twitched in patterns David was beginning to recognize as complex emotional states rather than simple stress responses. When she caught him watching, she made the subtlest of gestures, a slight inclination of her head toward the courtroom's side corridor that could have been coincidental if he hadn't been trained to notice diplomatic microcommunications. David glanced around the courtroom, confirmed that his absence wouldn't be immediately noticed among the chaos of recess discussions, and made his way toward the indicated corridor with the casual stride of someone seeking refreshment facilities rather than unauthorized contact with defendants. Queen Vithara joined him in the corridor's alcove with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to conducting sensitive conversations in public spaces without appearing to do so. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that David's enhanced hearing recognized as multiple layers of meaning embedded in apparently simple words. "You understand languages in ways others do not," she said quietly. "Your translation errors were not errors. They were truth-telling that made your superiors uncomfortable." David blinked, processing this observation through his recent disciplinary actions. "My supervisors felt that explaining why alien jokes were funny detracted from diplomatic efficiency. Because humor reveals cultural assumptions that formal diplomacy prefers to ignore." Her ears twitched with what was definitely amusement. "You told truth about what beings actually meant rather than what they claimed to mean. And that got me demoted to courtroom observation duty," David said, though he was beginning to suspect this conversation had implications beyond career counseling. "Your Majesty, what exactly are you trying to accomplish with this human prize request?" Queen Vithara's expression shifted to something David couldn't quite identify, though her bioluminescent earrings, jewelry he'd assumed was decorative, began pulsing with patterns that looked suspiciously like encryption sequences. "The charges against me were manufactured. Trade violations, territorial disputes, tax evasion, all cover stories for something much worse." David felt his linguistic instincts engaging with the complexity of her statement. "Cover stories for what?" "For documenting evidence of human corporate conspiracy to destabilize Nexarian territories," she said, and her words carried the weight of someone who had been waiting weeks to tell this truth. "A consortium of Earth-based corporations has been engineering conflicts, manipulating trade relationships, and creating crises that justify military intervention and resource extraction." The corridor suddenly felt much smaller and significantly more dangerous. David's training had covered conspiracy theories, corporate espionage, and the kind of political manipulation that made diplomatic translation challenging. But Queen Vithara was describing something on a scale that would redefine interstellar relationships if proven true. "The harmonic safe key you mentioned," he said carefully, "what does that actually do?" "It's quantum encryption technology that interfaces with Earth-specific electromagnetic signature," she explained, her ears flattening slightly with what David recognized as controlled fear. "The consortium stores their operational data on servers that require human biometric authentication and neural pattern recognition. Only someone with Earth-origin genetics and linguistic processing capabilities can access the evidence." David absorbed this information while watching her micro-expressions for signs of deception or desperation. Instead, he saw the kind of controlled terror that came from understanding dangers others couldn't see. "And you need access to that evidence because military escorts are en route to ensure my convenient disappearance after conviction," Queen Vithara said quietly. "The trial was orchestrated to discredit me before I could present proof of human involvement in Nexarian destabilization. My crimes were attempts to gather documentation of systematic manipulation designed to justify what will look like legitimate expansion into our territories." Through the corridor's transparent walls, David could see ships taking position around the tribunal station, their approach patterns suggesting official business rather than ceremonial presence. Those escorts, consortium security, operating under official military authorization that makes their actions appear legal. Her voice carried harmonics of resignation mixed with desperate hope. "Unless someone with human clearance can access and broadcast the evidence before they arrive." David's translator instincts were screaming warnings, about getting involved in conspiracies that transcended his security clearance. But his pattern recognition was also noting the consistency of Queen Vithara's statements with observed facts. Her trial had focused on technical violations rather than substantive crimes. Her accusers had been notably uninterested in her testimony about underlying causes, and the approaching escort ships were maintaining formation patterns consistent with containment rather than transport. "The human prize," he said slowly, "isn't about restitution at all. It's about legal protection for someone willing to help you expose the conspiracy. The bonding creates quantum entanglement with the encryption systems," she confirmed. "Legal asylum under Nexarian law, access to the harmonic frequencies needed to penetrate consortium security, and constitutional protection against extradition for anyone acting as official witness to interstellar crimes." David looked back toward the courtroom where delegates were beginning to reassemble for the tribunal's decision. "And if no human volunteers?" Queen Vithara's ears flattened completely against her skull. "Then the evidence disappears along with anyone who might corroborate it. The consortium's timeline proceeds as planned, and both our peoples end up in a war engineered by those who profit from conflict." The corridor's atmospheric processors registered the approach of tribunal guards, indicating that recess was ending. David had perhaps 30 seconds to decide whether his career as a diplomatic translator was worth preserving at the cost of potentially preventing an interstellar war. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "when the tribunal asks for volunteers, what exactly happens to the human who accepts?" Her silver eyes met his, with an expression that combined gratitude with profound regret. "They become permanently bonded to alien justice, capable of accessing truth that others cannot see, and forever changed by responsibilities they never asked for." David nodded, understanding that his comfortable life of linguistic observation was about to end regardless of what choice he made. "That sounds like the most honest job description I've heard in years." The tribunal reconvened with the kind of cosmic formality that made David's recording equipment register anticipation as measurable electromagnetic disturbance. Chief Judge Mordenthan's energy pattern had stabilized into configurations that suggested legal conclusions had been reached, though whether those conclusions would prevent or precipitate disaster remained diplomatically unclear. "After extensive review of interstellar legal precedent," the chief judge announced, "the tribunal finds that Article 12 of the Restitution Protocols does permit culturally appropriate compensation proposals, including those involving voluntary service agreements between convicted parties and members of affected species." David felt the courtroom's atmosphere shift as delegates processed this ruling. The human delegation's outrage intensified, while other species representatives seemed primarily focused on not getting involved in what was clearly becoming a much larger political situation than anyone had anticipated. "However," Judge Mordenthan continued, "such agreements require explicit consent from the proposed human participant, full disclosure of all obligations and protections involved, and verification that the arrangement serves legitimate interests of interstellar justice rather than personal vengeance or political manipulation." Queen Vithara stepped forward with regal composure that didn't quite conceal the tension in her pointed ears. "I accept these conditions and request permission to explain the full scope of the proposed arrangement." Ambassador Santos rose with diplomatic protests already forming. "The human delegation objects to any proceeding that treats our citizens as potential property for alien legal arrangements. This entire proposal violates fundamental principles of—" "Ambassador," David interrupted, rising from his observer position with the kind of authority that came from 3 years of preventing diplomatic disasters through linguistic precision. "Perhaps we should hear the full proposal before determining what principles it violates." The courtroom fell silent as delegates processed the unusual sight of a demoted translator publicly contradicting his own ambassador. David felt every eye in the chamber focusing on him, including Queen Vithara's silver gaze that carried gratitude mixed with what looked suspiciously like carefully controlled hope. Translator Kellerman, Ambassador Santos said with the tone diplomats reserved for subordinates who had just crossed very bright lines, "You are here as an observer, not a participant in these proceedings." Actually, Chief Judge Mordaunthan interjected, legal precedent allows any member of the affected species to volunteer for Article 12 arrangements, regardless of their official role in the proceedings. If Translator Kellerman wishes to hear the full proposal, the tribunal is obligated to present it. David felt the moment crystallize around him, like quantum probability collapsing into fixed reality. Through the courtroom's transparent walls, he could see the escort ships maintaining their approach pattern, their timing suggesting they expected the tribunal to conclude within the next few hours. Queen Vithara's bioluminescent earrings pulsed with encryption patterns that his linguistic training allowed him to recognize as countdown sequences. "Your Majesty," he said formally, "please explain the nature of the proposed arrangement." Queen Vithara activated the courtroom's holographic display systems with gestures that suggested familiarity with legal technology that exceeded normal defendant access. The images that appeared showed data networks, communication logs, and financial transfers that painted a picture of conspiracy spanning multiple star systems. "The charges against me were manufactured to prevent presentation of evidence documenting systematic human corporate manipulation of Nexarian territories," she announced, her voice carrying harmonics that made the crystalline courtroom resonate with authority. Over the past 3 years, a consortium of Earth-based corporations has been engineering conflicts, manipulating trade relationships, and creating crises that justify military intervention and resource extraction. The holographic display shifted to show communication intercepts, financial records, and operational timelines that revealed coordination between corporate interests and military planning. David's linguistic training allowed him to process the multiple language streams simultaneously, recognizing patterns that confirmed everything Queen Vithara had told him during their corridor conversation. The harmonic safe key technology I mentioned creates quantum encryption interfaces that require human biometric authentication and neural pattern recognition, she continued. The evidence of consortium operations exists on servers protected by Earth-specific security systems that only someone with human genetics and advanced linguistic processing capabilities can penetrate. Ambassador Santos was on his feet with objections that David could see were based more on political convenience than legal principle. These allegations are unsubstantiated conspiracy theories designed to justify. "Ambassador," David interrupted again, his voice carrying new authority, "the evidence appears quite substantiated. The question is whether the tribunal will have opportunity to evaluate it before external forces intervene to prevent such evaluation." Through the display screens, he could see the escort ships reaching final approach positions, their formation patterns now clearly indicating containment rather than ceremonial escort. The timing suggested that someone had been monitoring the tribunal proceedings and coordinating intervention to prevent inconvenient revelations. Queen Vithara's ears twitched with what David recognized as controlled desperation. The bonding ceremony creates legal protection for the human participant under Nexarian asylum law, quantum entanglement with the encryption systems necessary to access the evidence, and constitutional immunity from extradition for anyone acting as official witness to interstellar crimes. "And the obligations?" Chief Judge Mordaunthan asked, though his energy pattern suggested he already understood the implications. "Permanent responsibility for maintaining and protecting evidence of interstellar conspiracy, ongoing cooperation with allied species in investigating corporate manipulation, an acceptance that return to previous life patterns may be impossible once truth becomes known. Her voice carried harmonics of regret and determination. The human participant becomes bridge between species, keeper of inconvenient truths, and target of those who profit from engineered conflicts. David felt the weight of the choice settling around him like gravity from a collapsing star. His comfortable career as a diplomatic translator was ending regardless, either through his involvement in exposing conspiracy or through the war that would result from its concealment. The escort ships were minutes from docking. Queen Vithara's evidence would disappear along with anyone who might corroborate it, and both human and Nexarian civilizations would be manipulated into conflicts that served only corporate interests. "Your Majesty," he said, stepping forward from the observer section toward the defendant's platform, "I volunteer to accept your proposed arrangement." The courtroom erupted in chaos that made the earlier diplomatic outrage seem like polite disagreement. Ambassador Santos was shouting about treason and unauthorized agreements. Other delegates were vocalizing in languages that made David's translator circuits overload, and the escort ships were accelerating their docking procedures, with timing that suggested they'd been monitoring court communications. But through all the noise, David heard Queen Vithara's voice carrying harmonics of profound relief. "Do you understand that accepting means you can never return to the life you knew?" David smiled, watching the escort ships through the courtroom's walls while feeling more certain about this decision than he'd ever felt about anything in his diplomatic career. "Your Majesty, I've been mistranslating my life for years. Maybe it's time to try accurate interpretation for a change." The bonding ceremony began immediately, not because of legal efficiency, but because the escort ships had begun docking procedures, with timing that suggested they'd been monitoring tribunal communications and preparing to intervene the moment Queen Vithara's evidence became legally admissible. David found himself standing beside the defendant's platform, while crystalline resonance fields activated around them, creating an environment where quantum entanglement could occur without interference from external electromagnetic sources. The harmonic safe key integration requires complete neural synchronization, Queen Vithara explained, her voice carrying new harmonics as the ceremonial fields established connection between their bioelectric patterns. "You'll experience temporary disorientation as your linguistic processing centers interface with Nexarian quantum encryption protocols." David felt the first wave of integration hit his nervous system like being struck by lightning made of pure information. Suddenly, he could access data streams that existed in quantum superposition, translating encrypted communications in languages that didn't technically exist until observed by conscious minds capable of collapsing probability waves into coherent meaning. Through the courtroom's transparent walls, he watched escort troops in full combat armor moving through the station's docking bays with the efficient purpose of soldiers conducting a classified operation. Their approach timing suggested they'd expected to arrive after Queen Vithara's conviction, but before any inconvenient evidence could be presented or preserved. "The integration is complete," Queen Vithara announced, though David could feel the process was far more complex than her words suggested. His mind now contained access protocols for encryption systems he hadn't known existed, quantum interfaces that allowed real-time translation of data streams across interstellar networks, and legal protections under Nexarian asylum law that made him simultaneously more valuable and more dangerous than any diplomatic translator in human history. "Honored Tribunal," David said, his voice now carrying harmonics that resonated with the courtroom's crystalline architecture. "I request permission to present evidence obtained through harmonic safe key access to consortium communication networks." Chief Judge Mordenthan's energy pattern shifted to configurations that suggested profound legal fascination mixed with cosmic-scale concern. "Permission granted." though the tribunal notes that such evidence may have implications extending far beyond this restitution proceeding. David activated his new quantum access capabilities, feeling his consciousness expand to encompass data streams spanning multiple star systems. The evidence that flooded through the courtroom's holographic displays was overwhelming in scope and damning in detail. Financial records showing corporate payments for engineered conflicts, communication logs coordinating with corrupt military officials, operational timelines for systematic destabilization of Nexarian territories, and strategic planning documents that treated interstellar war as a profitable business opportunity. The assembled delegates watched in silence that grew heavier with each revelation. Corporate executives discussing civilian casualties as acceptable business expenses, military commanders coordinating with private interests to justify expanded operations, and political figures receiving payments to support policies that served consortium interests rather than human welfare. Ambassador Santos had gone pale as the evidence revealed his own involvement in covering up consortium activities, while legal coordinator Williams was frantically trying to establish communication with Earth authorities who might not be compromised by corporate influence. The escort troops had reached the tribunal chamber's outer security perimeter, but their approach had slowed as they presumably received new orders from superiors trying to process the implications of the evidence broadcast. "The pattern is systematic," David announced, his enhanced linguistic capabilities allowing him to synthesize information across multiple data streams simultaneously. Corporate manipulation designed to create conflicts that justify military intervention, resource extraction, and expanded human presence in territories that resist voluntary cooperation. Queen Vithara's pointed ears twitched with satisfaction mixed with grim vindication. "My crimes were attempts to document and prevent this manipulation. Trade violations were cover for intelligence gathering, territorial disputes were resistance to monitoring station installation, and tax evasion was redirection of funds to protect civilian populations from engineered conflicts." The escort troops had stopped at the chamber's entrance, apparently receiving communication from authorities who were rapidly recalculating political positions based on the evidence being broadcast to diplomatic networks across the galaxy. Through his quantum access, David could monitor their communications in real time, watching as orders shifted from contain and eliminate to assess and report, to avoid unnecessary escalation pending further investigation. Chief Judge Mordenthan's voice carried cosmic authority as he addressed the courtroom. In light of evidence presented through legally obtained quantum access, the tribunal declares original charges against Queen Vithara to be dismissed pending full investigation of underlying conspiracy. Furthermore, the evidence of systematic corporate manipulation constitutes crimes against interstellar peace that require immediate referral to the Galactic Security Council. David felt the quantum entanglement settle into permanent configuration, making him aware that his integration with alien encryption systems was now irreversible. His consciousness existed partially in quantum superposition, capable of accessing information streams that spanned interstellar space, but unable to return to the simple linear existence he'd known as a diplomatic translator. The consortium's timeline called for military escalation within the next 6 months, he announced, processing data streams that revealed the full scope of planned manipulation. Evidence suggests coordination with human supremacist factions, seeking to justify aggressive expansion policies through manufactured crises. Queen Vithara moved closer to David, their quantum entanglement creating visible energy patterns that painted the crystalline courtroom in colors that hadn't existed in either of their languages before the bonding. The harmonic resonance will allow us to monitor consortium communications in real time, preventing future manipulation while providing early warning of planned destabilization efforts. Through the chamber's transparent walls, David watched the escort ships beginning departure procedures, their mission obviously canceled by authorities who understood that eliminating witnesses would no longer prevent evidence disclosure. His quantum access allowed him to monitor their retreat communications, confirming that the immediate threat had been neutralized, though larger political consequences were just beginning. Ambassador Santos approached with the expression of someone whose career had just been redefined by events beyond his control. Translator Kellerman, your actions today have prevented what could have been the largest interstellar crisis in recorded history. However, your bonding with alien encryption systems raises security concerns that will require. Ambassador, David interrupted, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate directly with the speaker's nervous system. My security concerns now extend beyond human interests to include the welfare of multiple species. The evidence suggests that preventing corporate manipulation serves human welfare better than protecting corporate secrecy. 6 months later, David stood in the same crystalline courtroom, though his role had evolved from observer to permanent liaison between human and Nexarian intelligence services. The consortium trials had concluded with convictions spanning multiple star systems, corporate executives facing charges for crimes against interstellar peace, and new cooperative agreements designed to prevent similar manipulation in the future. Queen Vithara maintained her position as primary witness and coordinator of ongoing investigation efforts, their quantum entanglement having evolved into something approaching partnership in maintaining interstellar security. David's linguistic capabilities, enhanced by alien integration, allowed him to monitor communication networks across human space for signs of similar conspiracies, while providing translation services that revealed truth rather than concealing it. Any regrets about accepting the bonding? Queen Vithara asked, her pointed ears twitching with amusement as they reviewed reports of successful prevention of 3 additional corporate manipulation schemes in the past month. David considered this while watching Earth through the station's viewport, his enhanced consciousness simultaneously monitoring data streams from 17 different star systems and translating diplomatic communications that would have overwhelmed his previous capabilities. My supervisors were right about one thing, he said finally, grinning as quantum data streams painted aurora patterns across his enhanced consciousness. My translation methods were definitely too creative for standard diplomatic work, but apparently they're exactly what interstellar justice needed. Through their quantum bond,